who I've known for several years. We were neighbors over at 4018, and we had some contact before we moved to 4018. She's a physiotherapist, not an occupational therapist, whose area of research is focused on concussion, and which is, of course, a very, very hot area, which she helped make it a hot area, I would say. And it gets a lot of press, lay press as well. I think, if I understand correctly, what she's going to do today is she's using her concussion studies as kind of an example of how research can be based in the clinic. And I guess they're going to be, I know you're going to be talking about concussion, but there's probably a lot of lessons for people in the room who are doing other kinds of clinical research. Is that correct? Anyway, welcome and thank you for doing this.
Thank you. Take that back. Thank you, Michael. Okay, so exactly as Michael just said, I wasn't too sure how to approach this seminar. I discussed it with my grad students, and I decided not to, I'm standing on the right side of the line, not to come and present specific research project results so much as to exemplify how you can integrate clinic and research and make one feed off each other. There's a few research results, but that's basically what I thought I would approach this. So this is what we do. So what would you do with 155 fields of data collected on 700 patients, new patients per year, collected in a very systematic way and entered in a database in a very systematic way? So that's what planning a clinical program and embedding research program evaluation and research in it, that's what it leads to. And that's the example that I'm going to use today to showcase exactly that. The Montreal Children's Concussion Clinic does exactly that. So that was a clinic that has been going on for almost 10 years. And when we designed it, we also designed it with a very heavy clinical data collection side to it, because we knew we wanted, back in 2007, concussions were sort of a hot topic, but not as much as they are now. But we knew we wanted to track different things that we were going to propose, because this clinic was an innovative way to approach care with this population. So right from the start, this was a foundation-supported clinic when it first started. Now it's on the budget of the hospital. But we built in some money for a research, an administrative assistant that would have some of her time devoted to data entry. So it's set up. So it's set up so that it sees a lot of the concussions that come through the emergency department, but not all. So at the Children's, we see about 1,500 concussions a year in the emergency department, and about 700 of those make it to the concussion clinic. That means they need a bit more care than just instructions, go home, you'll get better. The goal of the clinic is really to return the kids to life. So we call it return to life because it's return to sports, but it's also return to school and return to social activities and violin lessons and everything the kids want to do. And we set it up also as a collaborative process between the sporting associations, the schools, and do a lot of education or community outreach there. The kids under the age of 5 have a separate follow-up. They're not seen in the concussion clinic because their issues are different. They're not in school. So I don't know how much you know about concussions. Of course.
And that is, are you also, is your data set also including the kids that come into the emergency department? So is there a link between the emergency department and your concussion clinic?
So the other 600 are not collected within this database because they don't come through. But we know who they are from another set of tools. So we follow them. We don't follow them, but we can see the concussions that come through the SIERG system, but also through something that's called CHIRP, which is the Canadian Child Health, the Trauma Surveillance System. It's a National Stats Canada injury surveillance system throughout the country. And it's coordinated through the trauma program at the children, and everybody who comes in with an injury in the hospital fills out a little form.
But the concussions that come to the emergency department are not part of your data set.
No.
It's only the ones that come to the clinic.
That's right.
Would it not be helpful, or is it not important that there be this link between the kids coming to the emergency department and the clinic?
There could be, but we would have very little data on them that we can't already get through. When we want to know something about the kids who only come through emergency department, we can just do a chart audit to review that, but it would take a lot of manpower to track them 24 hours a day, get all their data from Oasis and Surge, and the very mild cases who don't make it.
Have a unique hospital number.
Yes.
So I'm just saying, I guess, for kids that come in with a complaint of concussion to the emergency department,
yes,
they're part of the total study population of kids that are suspected of having a concussion.
Well, that come to our hospital.
Exactly.
Which is not necessarily. I mean, it would be valuable, but it really is not the case. No. Okay, so concussions.
She's defining her population. It's not actually part of her population. She's defining her population as kids that are severe enough. No, the kids are severe enough to need to follow. It's the ones that go home without need for follow that are enough. I mean, she's just drawing a line of severity.
Well, I'm just saying. I'm just thinking.
I think the bigger problem is the fact that only kids come here rather than kids of the same severity to go elsewhere.
But I would be interested in knowing if kids come for mild concussion are sent home and then come back.
Oh, that we know.
For example,
that we can know.
So, well, that's what I'm getting at. Actually, it's because as we learn more about concussion, we know that a first contact with an emergency department may not be the last contact of a child.
For sure.
And will end up in your clinic sometime. A very small number, I agree. But still, anyway, that was my question.
No problem. So, they're a traumatic brain injury on the milder spectrum, or the milder end of the spectrum for sure. And the findings that are found clinically cannot be linked to alcohol consumption or other comorbidities. I'm bringing this in because the diagnosis of concussion is still very clinical. There is no biomarker, there is no imaging test. Nothing defines concussion more than clinical signs. And clinical signs are very nonspecific. So when the diagnosis is made, it has to be clear that it is not linked to something else. So that's, I'm having a little bit of issues with this little thing. So the changes are acute. And it's usually to be defined as a concussion, there can be no changes on routine structural imaging. Okay, so we're out of the realm of bleeds. No bleeds, no contusions. Otherwise, they're moved into another category of TBIs. So this is what is thought from animal studies to be happening after concussion, which is essentially a lot of functional changes, energy crisis, a bit of cell damage that's difficult to pick up. In some cases, we can actually see axonal injury, but very rarely and not in the acute phase. The diagnosis or the diagnostic signs are really based on what the child reports and on what others observe. That's a common mistake. A lot of times people ask the kids how they feel, and if they can't recognize that they're not feeling well, or if they want to hide things, the second step is not done. If you actually observe somebody who's just been hit or had a concussion, you can see that they're not moving the same, reacting the same, whether it's a sport injury or not, there's a change. So that's how we see it. And the recovery is a bit longer in kids than originally thought, and then in adults. So although adults or athletes are usually said to be recovered within the first 10 to 14 days, kids will take a bit longer, and up to 30% of them still have symptoms after a month. So telling a child that they're recovered after a concussion after a week is probably not the best idea, because you're creating expectations that are never going to be met. So why is it important to look at in kids? I don't think I have to convince you, but just in case, most of the incidents of the cases that present to these are US-based numbers, but presenting to hospital, they're really in the 0 to 4 category, 5 to 14, and 15 to 24. So these top 3 lines are the age groups that we're concerned with here. The next group there is the 65 and over. So we have this bimodal distribution of cases where very young kids, and you see these are the 0 to 4, so they have the single most, the highest presentation.
That's only 2010. Because of all the publicity.
Well, it's probably, but people are more, yeah, so there's probably not more, but there's more awareness, and they're being brought in to emergency departments a bit more. So that's just the same thing in different ways. So concussions at the MCH, bimodal integrated way of managing them. All of them show up at the emergency department, and there they get a generalized approach of instructions, education, what to do, etc. If they need to, depending on certain criteria, they'll be sent to the more individualized approach, which is the concussion clinic. But also kids coming not from the ED also go here from the community physicians who see them initially, who manage them initially, and then find them not to recover as expected and send them along. So if we're having an individualized approach, it's based on injury severity, based on the age of the child, their developmental stage, their premorbid academic and other conditions, and premorbid activity level. It's not the same managing somebody who's very, very active versus somebody else who's less. So this is just to show you who comes to this is to the clinic. So to the clinic, obviously, I told you why there's nobody in the 0 to 5 because they get something else. But other than that, it's the teenagers. And this group is less, these pure numbers. So this group is less because the cutoff at the hospital is 17, but the cutoff for trauma in general in Quebec is 16 or 15, end of 15th year. So 16 years old, they get deferred. If they come by ambulance or they come by somebody tells them where to go, they get sent to the general. So we're lacking a few cases there. But if they walk off the street, they can pick and go wherever they want. Distribution, a bit more males than females overall, as in all trauma. And the cause, so the blue one is organized sports, recreational sports, and non-sports related. So a significant proportion of the kids who show up at the clinic are from sports. So sports distribution, hockey, football, soccer, that's our main presentation of kids.
So you're not considering kids falls off a bicycle
No.
as a sports injury?
As a sports injury, no, as a fall. Yeah. If they've been hit, then it's a motor vehicle. Whatever, it depends. But it's not part of sports. Okay, so that's the end of the presentation. This is, I don't need to explain this, but I just wanted to put it up there because this is the pathway of care for the kids who come to clinic. And it includes getting an assessment by a coordinator, then a physiotherapist, then a neuropsychologist if they need to. If they have symptoms, they come back, etc. So it's a complex pathway, but I wanted to show it because that's what we get the data on, these encounters and these. So the database itself is, I'll just check the time here. So the database itself is comprised of 3 different categories. Mainly the initial visit is where you get the most fields. Then the follow-ups have just additional follow-up data on some of the fields because all that history and risks and all that is in the initial. And at discharge, there's a few other things that get put in. So that's that story. And what do we do with this data? And I say we because I was part of the founding of this clinic. I practiced as a clinician in it for a long time, and now I'm only doing research in it, but I'm part of many of these things, so it's really, really embedded in it. So, of course, we use the data for clinical program improvement, so for quality control and quality improvement. We use it for locally initiated projects. We use it for participation in multi-center projects. Sometimes they want to, we participate in these different things. And one that cannot be ignored is for administrative needs and Ministry of Health requirements that are ongoing and all the time. How many patients do you see? How long do they stay? So without this very well-maintained database, it's difficult to answer those questions specifically. And it helps maintain our relevance and need for existence. Let me just put it that way, because we're always on the verge. Okay, so that's the background. And I'm going to take an example of something we've done over the last 10 years where we've used clinical data from this database at different stages to inform further the research agenda in it. And I take this example because it's something that we really contributed to the literature and to clinical practice change quite a bit over the years in concussion management. And it's rehabilitation options for the kids who don't recover as well after a concussion. So this all started 10 years ago as a clinical program and a clinical idea that we had the kids who had moderate and severe injuries get up in the ICU as soon as they were stable. Yet we told concussion, or international recommendations told us that for concussion, they should not do anything. So they should rest until they got better. Yet the kids with moderate and severe, who had the bleed and the contusion, we got up, we got moving around, we pushed, we ignored a little bit whether they had this little headache or this little feeling of whatever it was. So we had this contradiction between care. So we decided to ignore or work with the international consensus statement, but step a little bit aside from that and to try to exercise, get them moving, the kids who had concussions. So using exercise as a treatment. And I don't have to convince anyone here that exercise is good for many reasons. For cognitive, mood, headaches, it's good. So we put this out there back in 2009. This was the clinical model that we put out there. And this is what I want to show you. Oh, so this was a video, and I guess for the change it didn't work. So basically, it's a program that uses aerobic exercise, get the kids moving with their symptoms. So whether they're feeling a little headachy or dizzy, we use it anyway. Very low intensity to begin with, and progressed over time to get better. So that's the aerobic component. There's a coordination or sport-specific component where we put the kids back into something that resembles their sport, but is still a safe way to get reacquainted with sports. There's a mental imagery component or visualization component where they can get activated without actual movement. And there is an education motivation, cognitive behavior therapy sort of model built in the rest of it, as well as a home program because we don't have them come back to the hospital to do this. So they have a log, they track themselves, they have home programs, and it's followed weekly by the physiotherapist. Of course.
I'm a little bit surprised by what you just said. If there was this I understand that this is contradiction between what they were doing with the severe cases and what you're doing with the mild cases. But how did you know that what they were doing with the severe cases wasn't the right thing? I mean,
was it the wrong thing to do with the severe or the milds?
No, they were getting the kids up with the severe ones. They were getting them up and moving and doing a little bit of exercise instead of resting. And with the mild cases, they were resting, which seems like a contradiction.
Totally.
But how did you know? Why did you not change the care of the kids with the severe ones if you had them rest?
Because nothing. Well, we could have, I guess, but
did anybody randomize?
Or pre-post?
This part, yes, but the moderate severe, I just brought that example, but we don't rest anybody. The people with strokes are not rested, and there are trials on that. Resting is bad for you in many conditions, except for the first 2-3 days, of course. But everybody else, any neuro population, as soon as you can, You have them moving because it prevents disuse, it prevents deconditioning. Yes.
I know that. But why then are the guidelines different?
For mild?
Because here you
Okay.
are, you've been telling us. And,
Yeah, I can explain my theory. So no, it's
expert opinion, based on expert opinion. Yeah.
I'm not repeating
so
those.
If the expert opinion
Lots of times.
is
Isabelle.
as competent
Oh,
and as
stop it.
confident as you are, then I'm not understanding why the guidelines are so different.
Okay, so this is a story that's not. I'll take you through the story. It's not part of this, but I'll take you through the story. 2001, the sports community decided to tackle concussion because they were having some and people were not doing well and so on. And the sports community took concussion over, essentially, taking it out of the mild traumatic brain injury realm where people had expertise in getting, because before that date, we got them up, the mild traumatic brain injuries. Nobody rested them, even here. But after 2001, International Consensus, Concussion in Sports, put out this recommendation that people after concussion should rest. And then once they rested, they should return to activities based on a step-by-step program, resembling a lot the sports injuries. So knee injuries, that's what you do. You rest, you heal, you go back gradually. Ankle sprains, that's what you do. You rest, you heal, you go back gradually. So they had concussions on their hands and sort of ignoring the neurological brain injury component, took the model, rest, heal, return, step by step to your activity. 2001 put out this massive consensus statement with recommendations worldwide, and then the uptake happened. And these conferences occur over every 4 years. Another one in 2004 was almost even worse. And then in 2008, they started to open up these conferences to general researchers, not just their little group. And that's where we started to bring in these ideas. And now, 2016, which was the last one last year in Berlin, the exercise is actually part of it. So these consensus statements are based on whoever's in the room and whoever has competing priorities and whoever's models are being used to design these things. So that's my theory. I think it's sort of generally recognized now. So now, in the last 2 of these meetings, rest is much less of a focus, and there's a lot more recognition on the neural and on the brain part instead of the sports injury part. So that's sort of the story.
No one's saying that you need randomized trials.
So now there have been randomized trials on rest, strict rest for 5 days versus a little bit of rest or whatever you felt you could do, which was get up, walk around the house, do a few chores. And the kids who did not rest were much better off. It's like back pain, shoulder injuries. Rest is usually not the greatest idea. So there are rest randomized trials that occurred, and there is one bigger one now out of CHIO that is randomizing the kids at 72 hours to post-injury to let them rest for a couple days and randomizing them to either do whatever they feel like doing. So that's symptom-limited activities. You feel good, you move. You don't feel good, you don't move. And a group that is imposed a bit more activity. We'll see. So we're still in sort of infancy mode versus that. But so remember that before 2001, mild traumatic brain injuries were treated as brain injuries in our programs, and they followed the same pathway as the others. So they had a hospitalization for 24 hours, and then they were told to activate and return to their life gradually. Does that answer a little bit of the question of the background? Okay, so we coming back to this. After doing it for a little while, we did a case series on the consecutive kids, so 16 consecutive kids, just to see if doing this exercise, back then it was not recognized as the thing to do, did it actually improve outcomes, or did it do nothing, or did it make them worse? Obviously it didn't make them worse. So we had these 16 kids were of different ages, mostly adolescents. I mean, 7 weeks post-injury. So that's a long time. That's almost 2 months post-injury that they had been resting, because if we did not do this, they would have been resting, because that's what they were told to do. And once we entered them into this intervention, a mean of 4 weeks later, they were returned to sports. So we concluded from there, of course, no control group, just a case series of what happens in clinic. This is from the clinical database. So we took consecutive patients and we looked at that. So it didn't do very much, and we added to the clinical database for just these kids qualitative interviews with the parents, and I put 2 small quotes. It was like there was a light in her eyes, her whole face changed after that exercise, and finally something was being done for my child, because otherwise it was just stay home and rest so we get better. So then we went on to do a non-randomized trial comparing our model versus a model somewhere else, so in Hamilton. And Jérôme Gauvin-Lepage, one of my postdocs, did this. We chose Hamilton because we can't randomize the kids here because everybody gets this. And we did not want to enter a trial where we were comparing the children with St. Justine. So we went out and we went to Hamilton, where they had a clinic, they had the same sort of follow-up, but no exercise embedded. So by that follow-up, I mean education, school accommodations, all of that, except for the exercise. So we followed the kids, we assessed them pre-intervention, and 2 weeks, 6 weeks, and 12 weeks post. And the main outcomes were, we took post-concussion symptoms, which is what is usually looked at in these cases. But we wanted to go one step over and above symptoms, just how you feel now, because that's not so relevant, and go more to quality of life and looking at how much of an impact that had. So not surprisingly, when we added a control group, everybody got better. They got the care, they didn't get the exercise, but they get the good follow. It's not like stay home and rest. Even in Hamilton, they had some follow-up, education, standardized follow-up. So on the symptoms, which is what you have above here, there were no changes. But in the quality of life, however, there was an improvement in quality of life in the group from Montreal, and the quality of life of the kids over there did not change that much over the 6-week follow-up period. So that told us that, okay, so the symptoms, they have a similar level of headaches, but 6 weeks after, they probably have very low levels of headaches, everybody. But in terms of how they feel or how they deal with school and how they are with this, they did better. And then what we did with the same data from the trial, we took the Montreal data and we compared it to a national sample that had been collected as part of another study we were part of, the 5P study that was trying to develop a clinical prediction model for who still has symptoms a month after injury. And we took the 3,000 children from this sample, took the kids who fit the same criteria as our 50 from the non-randomized clinical trial, and compared the outcomes of the 2 samples. And just to see, with a broader and more variable sample of kids who were not treated with exercise, how we would do. So we started out, this is the Montreal group is the red line, and the national group without Montreal, of course, is the blue line. And what we found is that in terms of symptoms, we started out with this a little bit more in Montreal, but ended up 6 weeks later at the same levels. So it's comparative effectiveness at the lowest level of that you can do, but it showed us that we think we're on the right track. We're doing something that doesn't hurt the kids, and seems to make the recovery or affect the recovery in some way. So then this is where so from that same Montreal sample, we plotted when they started the intervention. So they could be between 4 weeks and 12 weeks post-injury when they started the intervention. And when we plotted that, we saw that there may be a hint that if you started earlier, so this is the time where you started versus the time since you started, and this is the post-concussion scores or the symptoms you have. You seem 6 weeks after the intervention. If you started earlier, you seem to have better outcomes. So that was exploratory stuff. So what we did is, actually Danielle did, PhD student here, she actually went back to the clinical database because we have these 600-700 kids per year for a few years. And she went to see, and they come in randomly from physician's office, the emergency at different times. They're not all referred on the day of their injury and followed up. So she went to see with the natural variation of when they showed up, if they did better depending on when they came. So they were separated in less than 2 weeks, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 5 weeks, or 6 weeks or more post-injury. And we looked at their follow-up visit after initiation of intervention and see if the outcomes were different. I have to say, less than 2 weeks, they weren't supposed to start less than 2 weeks because our intervention said between 3 and 4 weeks. The clinicians, that's what they used. But sometimes for scheduling reasons, to accommodate somebody who needs to be somewhere, or there are a few kids who come a little bit earlier than that, who came a little earlier than that. And what she found that is, so she entered 569 kids in there. So from the clinical database, kids who fit the criteria of what she wanted to do, and then split them up. And at intake, the symptoms were similar. Initiating active rehab at 2, 3, or 4 weeks led to similar PCS levels 2 weeks later. And if you initiated 2, 3, or 4 weeks, you seem to have a little bit better outcomes than if you initiated 6 weeks or more.
Irrespective of age and irrespective of sex?
That they're all together. I'll come to sex in a minute. But yes, they're all lumped together. But the age is different, but it's mostly... So we open up at 5, but really the kids come between 10 and 16-ish. Okay. Yeah, between the groups they're similar, but they're all lumped together. Okay, sorry. Thank you, Danielle. Yeah. They're the same between the groups, but we think there may be a differential effect by age, like in a different story, but. I don't know, but for intervention. Anyway, so then what she did is initiate a pilot. We wanted then to see, you have to understand that when we started this, we were doing something that nobody wanted to do. Then we did it. It worked. Then we were doing it 4 weeks post-injury initiation. The clinicians were a little weary of trying this earlier. When Danielle can attest, when we went to them to say, okay, we are seeing from your data that there seems to be maybe a better outcome if you start a bit earlier. We would like to test it to see if that's actually the case. Starting at 2 weeks, they found it a bit early. So we had to convince them a little bit. And we did, before going on an all-out full RCT, we decided to do a feasibility study just to see if we could consent people and if they wanted to actually participate in this, they felt comfortable doing this, and if the clinicians would do it. So she ran this last year. Yeah. Last year. So recruited 10 kids in each group just for feasibility. And this is where we're at for this. So right now she's preparing the paper. It was feasible. We had one adverse event in each group, the group that started 2 weeks versus 4 weeks. But the adverse events, we were very loose on our definition of adverse events, and they happened 3 weeks after the initial, or even about 3 weeks after the initiation of the intervention, probably not linked to whether they started 2 weeks versus 4 weeks. And the clinicians embarked and all this. So we finished this. We said, okay, we're ready to run the full RCT, and the clinicians decided they had tested the 2 weeks and they wanted to do 2 weeks, and now it's 2 weeks. So again, we can't randomize and run an RCT locally. So we're going to see, that's where we're at. She's preparing the paper. Actually, I'm supposed to be reading the paper. We're going to send this out. and it's looking very promising. Of course, we're not powered for effect in there, but it's certainly not creating more problems. Okay, back to clinical data.
So the clinician said 10 patients in each group. Question answered, we're done.
Well, they said, but they didn't say that they were doing better. What they were concerned about, I don't think they think they're going to do better because we can't show them that. But they're not doing worse, and they were satisfied with 10 patients that it's not dangerous. And the thing is that the literature, I'm going to put this down, the literature is also moving behind us. We're trying to do things properly, but now the international recommendations say to start activating 3 days after, with no evidence whatsoever. So what are we supposed to do? Now the clinicians want to start earlier. Now that they're convinced that it's not dangerous, they said, why should we wait? We're going to hold them back from their life and hold them back from getting treatment or, activating based on nothing, because there's no more evidence on the other side that we should delay. That's right. So we are on all these kids who are now being seen at 2 weeks, which is the next step is to look at next year. We'll have this other 300 kids who have now gotten it at 2 weeks, and we'll see what happens. Yeah. But if you have the clinical data, I think that's my whole point today, is you can actually track this even if the research gets disorganized. You're lacking the control groups, and I totally agree with that. At least in here, we have a long time series of 4 weeks, and then we have a cut, and now it's a 2-week practice. So we'll be likely to take it. And my last point, I probably have way too much slides. Back to clinical data. So another hot topic in concussions is sex differences for all kinds of reasons. And I'm not now discussing whether we're talking about sex or gender or anything in between. I think we're limited to sex because we do not ask the kids, every kid, the ones who want to disclose one way or the other are welcome to do so, but we're not asking all the kids what they identify with. So we're kind of stuck with sex or what's on the medical card. So now there seems to be a recognition that girls are different than boys in terms of concussions. They show up with more symptoms after injury, but they also show up with way more symptoms before injury of the same types of symptoms. So because remember, the symptoms of concussions are really non-specific. Headaches, dizziness, tired, lack of concentration. In general, healthy girls report more of those symptoms than healthy boys. So it's not a big surprise if you don't take that into consideration that you find differences post-injury. Girls have way more symptoms than boys. So if you don't remember that pre-injury, you can also think. So there may be an effect, there may not be an effect. It's not really clear, but it's becoming a hot topic. So we said, okay, we can go look at that if we have again this database. So we did another data extraction from this clinical database and went to look at kids between 6 to 17 who presented with at least one symptom at 4 weeks post-injury, who got this intervention that I'm talking about, and who had 2 follow-up visits available. That turned into 355 kids. And this is the trajectory of recovery. Girls, boys, they have more symptoms all the way through. There seems to be a bit of a hint of interaction because the confidence intervals at the end overlap a little bit. So that's something to maybe continue looking at. Then
I think really different breakdown of ages. A 6-year-old is so different than a 17-year-old.
Yeah, I think I have the age back there. The age was fairly old. Yeah. No.
Mean isn't giving you the true picture.
Absolutely. So, but still to explore it initially. So the girls, however, seem to be recovering because they're finishing off at the same place as the boys, seem to be perhaps recovering a little bit faster. Who knows? It's something to explore. My only point with this was to show you the fact that we went back to the clinical database. We have not designed any studies for that, but I think that I took it out. But the last point here was that we need to power the studies for age. I totally agree, but also for sex. We have to not just use sex as a control variable in all the analyses we do, but actually look for sex differences in all the age groups. And we can only do that if we actually power the studies to have enough girls to do some analyses there and enough boys to do some analyses there, which is right now something not many people are doing. And unfortunately, then we can't learn much. So the fact that we know, I didn't highlight much, but the clinical prediction model the study we participated in, found that being a girl was actually a predictor of having more symptoms at 1 month post-injury than being a boy. But that's done without controlling for pre-injury levels that are higher. So it doesn't mean very much. So right now we tell girls you're going to take longer to recover, but I'm not convinced about that, because if that's their level of healthy level and it's high, of course they look higher than boys, but maybe it's just that. They're just a bit higher than boys and they're healthy being higher than boys. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. Exactly. We need more people. Of course.
Is a difference by position?
By physician.
Like,
so physicians have very little to do with this condition, because they only establish diagnosis in general in this model. They're not seen by a physician at any point after the diagnosis point. So they're seen by, if they come for the community, they'll be followed by their family physicians, but not on a regular basis and not over and above this. But it would be worth looking at difference by physiotherapists, for example, who implements the model, or by psychologists who manages the school issues, or by school, because some schools are better at managing concussions than other schools. So, yeah. Sports type, in terms of recovery.
the numbers are small.
Yeah, I don't think anybody's done that yet. Looking at whether sports practice predicts how well you recover. The only thing I can say about not prediction, but sports type, if the girls and the boys play the same sports, the incidence rates are the same. So soccer, there's not more concussions in boys than girls. Soccer is equal through. There's more boys in football because there's no girls in football. So there's more, you know what I mean? But no, I don't think anybody's looked at whether sport practice predicts how you will recover or how many symptoms you have before the injury. It's a good point.
In the study where you compared your population with the patients in Hammy, you didn't see a difference in terms of symptoms, but you saw a difference in quality of life. So many quality of life improve symptoms as well. Did you look at which component they increase? What I'm curious to know where they improve.
It's the emotional component that drives the quality of life improvement. So in the PEDS-QL, the tool we used, it's the questions that have to do with whether they're sad, whether they're upset, angry, irritable, things that look like those emotional type symptoms. So it's not the physical part, because the physical part is mostly what the symptoms are about, or what people think of as symptoms.
It's not the difference between
Did you notice the baseline rates were quite
But it could be. It could be.
Was there more follow-up in one?
No, the follow-ups were the same.
Or is more attention that we received from each program that could influence their mood?
There's a number of things, so I didn't get into that here, but in this study, Hamilton had a clinic to begin with that really looked like ours, which is why we picked that setting. In the middle, or a third of the way in, they got their funding cut for the clinic. So then the recruitment was community-based, and no, they weren't getting any care anymore, the kids from Hamilton. So being in the study became care. So it masks the effect a little bit because they weren't, getting the same care, only exercise different. These kids had been waiting in the community with nothing, and suddenly they had care through the study. So it masks a little bit. But yeah, it could be different things.
Oh, and was there something else you?
No, I'm fine. It's
I want to just move forward, since this was kind of to be a model for clinic-based research and databases. I wonder if I could ask you a question
of course.
To that aspect, because so we dealt with following recommendations which change over time versus randomization. I think that we kind of beat that one to death. But what about the single center versus the population base? Have you done it? I mean, you could use CHIRP, for example, although there's the kids around the country that are seen in CHIRP for their initial injury wouldn't necessarily follow.
No.
That would be a good place to, right? I mean, and if you want to know whether your program is doing anything, it seems to me that you have a possibility, you have to get funding for it, because I know that there's not any follow-up of those kids, routine follow-up of the kids that are seen in CHIRP, right? But
it depends, yeah.
And getting collaborators locally, let's say, not every center, but a few centers, actually see not what the effect of the kind of care you're providing is, which is probably very different, and in the absence of randomization, I think it would be really hard to control, but at least look at more of a population-based rate of recovery return by following up by phone kids who come in, in a broader population base. So is anybody doing that? I would think you would be able to get funding to do that. It is a national database that you could use for follow-up studies. Again, without studying what you're actually doing.
Yeah, I mean, just how they recover.
And then compare the places that have a program and places that don't.
So we have a bit of an opportunity through this clinical prediction model study that I can tell you a little bit more about. This is sort of what we wanted to do here. So this is a study that recruited in 10 ED departments, pediatric ED departments across Canada, for a derivation and validation study. But there's a lot of natural history data to take advantage of. So 2,000 kids from 10 centers for derivation, another 1,000 for validation. So the kids were taken within 48 hours of their injury, presenting to an ED. So it's not population-based. It's not people who don't go to the ED or stay in their sports or whatever.
That's true of CHIRP as well.
But it's definitely true of CHIRP, exactly. So it's the same population as CHIRP. Absolutely same. And they were followed up by phone or online, so no in-person visits, at 1 week, 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 8 weeks, and 12 weeks post-injury. So the recovery that you see here, that is natural recovery in Canada. Of kids who had, of course it was taken for a specific reason, so of kids who still had symptoms 4 weeks post-injury, that's them. How they fared at 12 weeks post-injury.
So okay, that's very interesting. It's more or less said that they essentially did what I was suggesting that somebody do. They've already done.
Yeah, but there's still lots to be done with this data set. So any additional questions, the data set is there.
So how do you know in this case, they ended up at the same place?
Yeah.
And your kids, not surprisingly, because the kids are because they're more severe than the ones who are not recommended for follow-up, started out with a higher score, and they ended up at the same place.
That's right.
Over time, 6 weeks later.
6 weeks, yeah.
But it doesn't. That may have nothing to do with the care that's provided. Right?
Absolutely.
This may mean that 6 weeks post trauma, that kids with more severe injuries end up being more or less in the same place as kids with less.
Yeah, well, that's actually 12 weeks. So yes, it could be natural history. Absolutely. There's no way to know this from there. And I don't think from this data set you could actually you could actually find that.
Did you match them based on the severity of the injury at the time they presented? Using
They are matched.
the red ones and the blue ones are matched?
At their time of injury, yes. So in terms of history of headaches, history of depression, they're all matched. Because, yeah, it was a voluntary activity. Because we couldn't control much of them, I don't know what happened to these kids, right? I have no idea. I just have their symptom scores. That's all I have.
But the symptom scores are so different at time 0.
Well, the kids who come, those all came to clinic, so maybe they're a different population. They only, it doesn't include all the Montreal kids who were in here, who still had symptoms that they told the research assistant they still had symptoms at a month, but never showed up in our clinic. The ones who showed up in our clinic had to be referred by somebody. So the parents are possibly a little bit different in terms of healthcare seeking behavior, or the kids were more severe at that time. I don't have much of a way of controlling that. What we did though, what we have not finished, but we wanted to do is look at our Montreal sample of these and separate it out. So not the kids who came to clinic, but the kids who showed up and emerged. So Montreal is not in there right now because I didn't want to overlap. But if I use this sample and I separate the Montreal kids and see how they fare or how they look at 4 weeks, maybe there's something to be done with that.
From your data, can you identify a cluster of repeat kids with concussion?
We can. They're not included in the studies I showed you today because the repeaters we think are a different group of people.
Well, I think that they are a very special group.
Yes, but yes, we can definitely track them with their unit number. It's very easy because this is all identifying data in the clinical. Yeah. So there's another project, Adrian. You can pick that up. So that's it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.